it was me and my friends used to just watch horror movies because they were kind of, everybody else was like, thought they were bad. It's like, how can you watch that gross stuff? So, we were kind of being rebellious and watching it. But it was so much fun. It was kind of a visceral thrill. We also would read like Fangoria magazine to see how the movie magic was made. But what really made me fall in love with the genre was A Nightmare on Elm Street, the original Nightmare on Elm Street. That was such a smart, terrifying original film. And that movie kind of made me show that there was a lot more to the horror genre than just killing people on screen. I have to make it very clear I do not condone killing people in real life.
Well, that's good. That's always good. Is there a particular Nightmare on Elm Street movie that you were a fan of?
The first one is still my favorite film. It's my favorite horror film. It's my favorite film, hands down, because it did really kickstart my love of the genre.
How did you get into screenwriting? What made you decide that you wanted to write movies, or I guess write for entertainment?
Well, I always knew. I grew up in Eastern Kentucky, small, very, very small town, I think 2,500 people. And I always knew I wanted to work in the movies. When I was young, I wanted to be an actor. That was my kind of goal in life. And I actually studied theater at Berea College in Kentucky. I got an internship, or I got into the summer program at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts over the summer when I was a sophomore, and went to New York and got an internship at New Line Cinema, which is the studio that made Final Destination and also Nightmare on Elm Street previously. And my initial focus was on being an actor, but it was in the early 90s. So non-traditional or diverse casting was not on anybody's radar back in the day. So, my agent was just like, there aren't many parts I can put you up for, just being honest. So instead of being like, I'm going to quit acting, I still wanted to work in the industry, and English was like my favorite subject in school. I've always loved reading and writing, and my English teachers have always been super encouraging to me. All my teachers were encouraging, but since I loved English so much, they obviously sensed that love in me and helped cultivate it. Well, I got the kernel of the idea when I was flying home to visit my family in Kentucky, and I read an article, I think it was in People magazine, about a woman who was on vacation in Hawaii, and her mom called her and said, don't take the flight you're on tomorrow, I have a bad feeling about it. And so the woman changed flights, and the plane that she was on crashed. And so that, I'm on a plane reading this, and I was like, oh, that's pretty creepy and interesting. So I kind of had the idea in the back of my head. I just didn't have a story for it. And when I decided to pursue writing, I was looking for an agent, and at the time they wanted you to write a spec episode of something that was already on television. So I love the X-Files. I was obsessed with the X-Files. So I was like, well, maybe I could take that premonition idea and put it into an X-Files episode. And so then I made the person who had the premonition, I made it Scully's brother, Charles, who had the premonition, and got a group of people off the plane. And then when they started dying, the police thought he was killing them. And so, it was kind of a perfect marriage. And then I got an agent, but my friends at New Line were like, don't send this to the X-Files. This is a really good idea. Like, you should develop it as a feature. So I just started developing it as a feature with some producers, and went through a lot of iterations. At first it was all adults, and then Scream came out, and then, teenagers were hot again for horror films. So they're like, can we make them all teenagers? I'm like, sure.
Obviously it changed from your initial script up into what became Final Destination. Kind of what's it like with that studio process, getting that initial script and then like seeing the changes and stuff, and like in terms of your original script and what eventually made it to screen, what were things that like you were able to keep, and what were some things that, obviously had to change or were changed?
I think that was probably the best thing about working at a studio for so long, is I got to see kind of how they made the sausage behind the scenes. So I knew a lot of the changes were, if a new director came in, or an actor came in, or, a new hit movie came out, the studio would be like, well, we need to make this more like that. So it was very helpful that I was always able to kind of separate my ego from the process, because I know it can be frustrating, especially if you don't know the behind the scenes stuff that's going on. You can take everything personally. So the change, my thing is like, as long as the movie gets better, I'm happy. And I think the biggest change that James and Glenn did, James Wong and Glenn Morgan were the writer-director team that came on, or James was the director, was in my version, it was very influenced by A Nightmare on Elm Street. So death, since it didn't kill them the first time, it basically used their survivor's guilt or something to haunt them in very kind of reality-bending ways, like A Nightmare on Elm Street, until they committed suicide. That looked like purposeful suicides. And then Alex figured out the pattern and that death was after them. But the studio thought that was pretty dark, which I don't disagree with. So James and Glenn came up with the Rube Goldberg kind of MO, where death used things, everyday things around you. And I actually think that worked out for the best, because I think my version would have definitely appealed to the Nightmare on Elm Street crowd, like the horror fans. But the finished version actually, I think, opened it up to a lot of people who don't really watch horror films have watched this film and been like, oh, I don't like scary movies, but I love the Final Destination movies. And I think that's because it's not as horrific as Nightmare on Elm Street, kind of terrifying scenes and suicide. So I think that was the biggest change that was for the better. And actually the important things to me stayed in there, like the characters and the character arcs, and deaths, Alex figuring out that there was a pattern to how they were dying, and figuring out that he could kind of try to stop it.
Now going into the second one, where you kind of were going in, I'm assuming with a different mindset of, okay, it's more of like a Scream style, death. We have the rules and everything now. What was it like going into the sequel and writing the sequel?
Well, I wrote the story for the sequel, and kind of what I wanted to do with that was take what I loved about sequels and expand on it or turn it on its head. So yeah, I definitely wanted to start off where we're focusing on a group of teenagers. So you think they're going to be the main characters, and then introduce these adults and, have all the teenagers except for Kimberly get killed off in the opening. So that was one thing I wanted to subvert. That was a lot of fun. And I wanted to expand upon the mythology of the first one, so it wasn't just telling the same story. So I wanted to have it that all the characters in the second movie, like, they find out that their fates are all connected because the people in the first film cheated death. So that it had a ripple effect. So I wanted to kind of expand the mythology. And, I love bringing characters back from the original film. So I originally had Alex and Clear coming back. We weren't able to get Devin, unfortunately, but if we'd had both of them, Clear was going to be killed off and Devin was going to kind of continue the legacy. But since we couldn't get Devin back, we killed Clear. And then, yeah, I was like, I probably would have kept her alive if I had known Devin wasn't coming back.
But out of curiosity, do you have, besides I'm assuming the first one, do you have a favorite Final Destination film?
I think the second one, I have to kind of agree with the fans on that one. Like it's fun. And again, I just got to do a lot of stuff that I wanted to do with the sequel in that one, and focusing on adult characters again. I think the death scenes were really, Shay Mackey, Gruber, and Eric Bress wrote the screenplay. I think they did a great job of, just making a really fun movie. I think that opening is probably that was another thing inspired by Kentucky. We were trying to figure out the opening scene, and originally it was going to be kids were going to spring break, and they were at a hotel that they were caught on fire. And the producer's like, we need to come up with something better than that. And I got behind a log truck on the way home to visit my family, and I pulled off the highway, and then I called the producer up, like, out of breath. I'm like, what about a log truck on a freeway? And he's like, that's the opening. And David Ellis, who's now no longer with us, sadly, directed that film, and he used a stunt. He had done stunts, so we knew that he was going to take whatever was on the page and just take it to the next level. And so that's one of my favorite openings of any horror film. And I don't think I'm biased, because I think again that a lot of that most of that goes to like the acting and to the directing and the editing in that scene. Like, David Ellis just made that such a beautiful scene.
Final Destination 6, is in active development. I believe you've said it's pretty much ready to go. What can you tell us about Final Destination 6? How does it kind of relate with the other films? And just kind of what can we expect?
There's a really great team on this one. Guy Busick, who worked on the last two Scream movies, and Laura Evans Taylor are writing the script. John Watts, who did the Spider-Man Tom Holland trilogy, created the story for that. Adam Stein, I was going to call him Adam Bean. Adam Stein and Zach Lipovsky are directing it. And all I can really say about it is it is very much a Final Destination movie, but the story really kind of digs into the franchise in a very unique way that we haven't seen before in the other films.
In regards to recommending horror films, giving horror movies to people looking for a good scare or just looking for something fun to watch, what's always your go-to answer? What's kind of the horror film that you feel comfortable recommending to most people?
I usually have to feel them out to see what kind of horror they like, because there are definitely some people who are squeamish, so then I'm not going to recommend anything that's too gory. But I think especially for younger people, I tend to go with Scream, because I love that movie. I do recommend Nightmare on Elm Street, but then I have to be it's 80s, it's very 80s. So, but I think Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream, Candyman, is another great film. So those are kind of three of my favorites. There's so many great horror films, so many. Get Out, the M. Night's first one. Why am I blanking on that one? Just because you asked me. I See Dead People. I can't believe I'm forgetting.
The Sixth Sense.
Yeah, The Sixth Sense. Thank you. Silence of the Lambs, I consider a horror film. So there's so many good ones. I usually just kind of feel out the person. I'm well, what kind of stuff do you like, and what kind of stuff would just I'm not going to tell some people to see Saw, even though I love the original. That's for a certain taste, or people who like certain types of movies. All
right. Well, Jeffrey, thank you so much for sitting down and chatting with me.
Of course.
I look forward to all your future endeavors. I'm really excited to see what the future holds. But now we're going to send it back over to the show.
All right. Well, have a great day, and everybody donate.